only way forward, I think now in 2024, is to be preemptive in your approach, because one of the most serious consequences if you get this wrong is to be prosecuted. All right?
And what I love about the identification element of the mental health and safety management system is that it forces management to say, "Hey, we've been measuring this for the past 2 quarters, and it keeps showing up that people feel discriminated against or people feel bullied in these departments. We need to do something about this."
I
Right?
think there are a lot of real benefits actually for using the ISO 45003 framework. We have talked about.
Hello, my name is César, and I'm the founder and managing director of Dharma Center for Wellbeing, and I would like to welcome you to our podcast, Re-Engaged at Work, a podcast designed with you in mind to help you improve engagement, retention, and performance through workplace well-being. Now, before we get started, make sure to click on the subscribe button below so you can be the first to benefit from the wisdom, knowledge, and experience of our distinguished guests. And speaking of distinguished guests, we have none other than Kizzy Augustin. Kizzy is a partner in the White Collar and Crime Investigations Group at Mishcon de Reya and currently heads the firm's health and safety practice. Now, Kizzy, before I properly introduce you, can you say hi to our audience?
Hi, audience. Nice to be here. Hopefully, you'll get lots out of this in the next hour or so.
All right, fantastic. Just to give you a brief introduction to Kizzy. Kizzy is a solicitor advocate with higher rights of audience. I like the sound of that, Kizzy. She has significant experience in defending companies and senior directors and employees in health and safety prosecutions. And one thing that I really, really liked about Kizzy as well is that she provides preventative consultancy advice concerning corporate policies and procedures to ensure, of course, compliance with UK and global health and safety legislation. As you can imagine, Kizzy is well-versed in health and safety leadership and governance risk, as well as the management of reputational risk for businesses. And this is something that we would actually talk about, reputational risk, in this episode. As you can imagine as well, she hosts loads of conferences and provides training on the law relating to, of course, health and safety issues across many, many industries. Given her numerous and outstanding contributions to the health and safety sector, Kizzy has been described as a leading individual in the Legal 500 and was voted one of the 15 most influential health and safety professionals by SHP. And besides being an extremely competent health and safety lawyer, Kizzy is a very compassionate woman as well. She is a staunch campaigner for true equality and diversity in the law. She is a professional mentor for young Black and other ethnic minority students. And Kizzy is also a champion for the retention of women in senior positions in the workplace. Kizzy, I'm exhausted.
It's always nice when someone else describes what I've done, what I'm doing. It's great. It reminds me of who I am.
It's incredible that you are so active in your sector. You're so active in the field, and you're so active outside of the field as well, just helping people out as well, which is you're the complete package, Kizzy.
I try my best. Really try my best.
Kizzy, I thank you so much, for coming to this episode, because obviously, we try to help employers and employees, again, improve performance, retention, and engagement through workplace well-being, and health and safety is a massive element in all of this, right? And you and I have spoken at length how the health element of health and safety has been forgotten, even though the legislation is very, very clear. And especially you that have, you have experience in the regulatory environment as well. I mean, this is something that cannot be ignored, right? And so in the next hour or so, I'm so looking forward to, to address all of the different elements of health and safety, specifically focused on psychosocial hazards. I mean, health and safety is a huge topic. We can talk about chemical hazards and physical and biochemical and ergonomic, but as we previously talked, we're going to focus primarily on hazards of a psychosocial nature. So, Kizzy, I just want to get your impressions, on how industry in general is doing in the management of hazards of a psychosocial nature based on your point of view.
Well, César, as you say, it's a really important topic. I think as I've gone through the years understanding certainly how we deal with risk in the UK. There's been much more focus on physical health or physical injury, preventing that, and less focus on sort of what we used to call, I'd say what we used to call the softer side of health and safety, which was the health part. There's just been less focus on it. As we've moved up to current day, there's much more prevalence of the impact of health, as in occupational health, and the impact it can have on employees. I mean, we understand physical risk factors, right? So that was the stuff that we understood really physically manifested itself, particularly in employees. But employers were very slow to the idea that psychosocial risk factors existed. And things like I don't know, circumstances that might affect an employee's response to work, or their conditions, or their relationships, or their, it was really difficult. And certainly in the law, for thinking about specific sectors, we've been very familiar with the idea of tight deadlines, pressurized environments, an inability to control the amount of work or the way in which you're working, and all of that leads to stress, which could then manifest itself in physical disorders. So I think on the whole in the UK we've been very slow to approach psychosocial risk as a real risk factor that needed dealing with. You touched on the legislation, César, and as we say, this is not new. What's new is the focus. So the legislation has been around for a long time. Health and Safety at Work Act, as we all know and love, has been here for over almost 50 years. Now, it was 50 years, actually, 50 years this year, which gives the duty. It gives that legal duty to ensure the health, safety and welfare of employees and non-employees. But that idea that you have to ensure the health, safety and welfare of employees includes managing identified risks, which I think really extends to identifying and assessing the threat of work-related stress and good well-being, and taking reasonable steps to prevent or control or eliminate those risks. So I think that's certainly been our starting point. And we are, I think, as a health and safety community, starting to really make some inroads with employers, large and small, to grip this by the horns and really understand the impact that getting mental health, getting workplace stress wrong can have on employees. And maybe we'll go into a bit more detail about that. So I do think we're on our way, long way to go to actually have all of the solutions in place, but at least we're starting to talk about it and normalize what psychosocial risk really is.
All right, Kizzy. Now, obviously, we have what I call the foundational legislation around health and safety, right? So we've got, every employer that employs 5 or more people, you've got the Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974. You've got the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations of 1999, with Regulations 3 and 5 that specifically stipulate. Regulation 3 says that you need to conduct risk assessments, of psychosocial hazards as well, and Regulation 5 states that you need to, put measures in place to manage those risks. So, I mean, that's fairly straightforward. And then you've got the Equality Act of 2010. Now, let's go a level higher, right? So this is like foundational legislation for every business in the UK that employs 5 or more people. Now, which sectors actually have that additional regulatory legislation that forces them to even pay more focus and more attention, to hazards of a psychosocial nature, Kizzy, you would say?
Well, I would say it's those higher risk environments. So for example, I said to you, the legal sector, as much as I think in the UK, we approach this in a way that if you are office-based, perhaps you don't have the same risks as somebody who is outside doing physical labor, who's exposed to, I don't know, equipment risk or technology risk. They may be slightly different. I would say those higher risk environments, actually where it's high pressured, is really where we need to focus our attention. So a perfect example, as I could take from the legal world, is where you are working 18-hour days. We've had a recent case of Vanessa Ford, who was an extremely diligent worker. She worked at a law firm in the city, and she was working, according to reports and an inquest that came out a couple of weeks ago, working 18-hour days, was going through some sort of kind of relationship issues, in the sense that she'd lost someone who was close to her. You're working very hard, you're dealing with very high pressure deals. These are things that need a turnover very, very quickly. You are completely immersed in your work, and maybe there's no real delineation between your work life and your home life. So with all of that stress that's going on, the issue was really around how is that being managed in the workplace environment. And I think those sorts of workplaces really do have to hold themselves in higher regard, because it's about reasonable practicability when it comes to managing risks of that nature. And also those risks have to be foreseeable. Now, if you are in an environment where this is a routine approach to work, or the stress is so immense that it's continuous and it's not just encountered by one, it's encountered by a number of employees, this is something that employers should be identifying, and they should be looking at things like guidance to incorporate. They should be looking at the international standards that might give them that framework that they can adapt their policies and practices to accord with, because these are things that are identifiable, they are foreseeable, and it's only reasonable for them to address those risks. So I'm not saying that this is akin to law, but I'd certainly say it's a very recent example of where we've seen mental health and well-being be an actual issue that actually in the past we've shied away from speaking about. I don't know if that's because employees have a fear of what might happen if they talk about suffering from psychosocial risks, or even just impacts on their mental well-being, because it feels like it's a failure of some sort to suffer in this way. So what we're trying to do, certainly in the legal profession, but also in others, is to normalize the conversations and actually find what we can to do to solve those problems. And that could be a number of things. And I think it attracts itself to a number of different sectors. But what we are suggesting at the first instance is looking at the likes of a good, suitable and sufficient stress risk assessment. That the regulators in the UK, Health and Safety Executive, very good guidance on how to conduct a stress risk assessment. But it also talks about other things like we have talked about work-life balance, for example. I don't necessarily subscribe to a work-life balance, but I think we need to normalize what work-life integration looks like. And that might include employers setting realistic deadlines or realistic workloads, encouraging time out, annual leave. There's lots of things I think that an employer could do to offer support and be on the front foot of identifying risks before we have all of the symptoms that employees are often suffering from.
Yeah, Kizzy, so something that I mentioned during the intro, something that I like about you is that you help clients take a preventative approach as well, right? So
Yeah.
preventative consultancy. We're going to get to that moment in just a couple of minutes. And so for all of the employers that are listening to us right now, if you already have an occupational health and safety management system in place, you need to include this psychosocial module, I call it, because you've got the system already set up, but you need to start including these hazards of a psychosocial nature, which are, you identify them in a different way. So in the typical, health and safety management system model, you've got to identify the hazards, you assess the severity, frequency, and impact, you put the control measures in place, and then you monitor to see if those control measures are actually working or not.
Mm-hmm.
So you follow the same process, the same kind of like 4 stages, if you want to
The same way
oversimplify.
you would, the same way you would with
Exactly,
a health and safety risk
exactly.
assessment.
But in the case of psychosocial hazards, the way that they are identified are different, because you're not walking around with a clipboard,
Hmm.
just looking for physical hazards. So you do need to make sure that you have that component that allows you to identify psychosocial hazards in a specific way. We'll talk about that later on.
Hmm.
And very importantly as well is you need to understand, what are the options available to you in terms of the primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions you can put in place to minimize or eliminate those hazards of a psychosocial nature. So it's not just a matter of having the system, it's a matter of really understanding the whole, area of psychosocial hazards in order to utilize that system appropriately. Now, and if you haven't got a traditional occupational health and management system, this is not rocket science, okay? You can actually build this, okay, with proper guidance and proper assistance as well. And that's what we do as a business as well. We help businesses set up mental health and safety management systems, but you need to do it. And now, again, we're going to go to the preventative and the proactive things that you can do. But before we actually address that, Kizzy,
Hmm.
what will happen to businesses, okay, from your perspective,
Yeah.
that are not paying attention and are not giving the focus that you were mentioning a few minutes ago
Hmm.
to hazards of a psychosocial nature? Let's say that something happens, and there's some kind of psychological harm, psychological injury. From your perspective, what are the consequences of not managing those hazards effectively?
Well, Cesar, you mentioned a couple of things which I definitely want to touch on, and then I'll come on to the consequences. So you mentioned about employers having perhaps occupational health surveillance, or at least identifying some of those risks. Psychosocial risk is just another risk that they need to take into account. One of the kind of most common criticisms of employers from a regulatory point of view is that you might well have surveillance in place, and that's great, and it's a great start, but it is about what you do with the output. What do you do with the recommendations that come up as a result of your surveillance approach? It's very similar to a risk assessment, as I was saying. The risk assessment that you would do for a normal health and safety risk assessment in the UK, you would identify those risks, you would perhaps prioritize them, but you would have control measures which would help you with that elimination, or at least a mitigation of those identified risks. Excuse me. And one of the things that regulators often comment on is the fact that when they look at risk assessments, very often they say, we haven't really seen a perfect risk assessment, so we don't know what one looks like, but there are very good examples of what good can look like. And one of the comments that they often make is that you haven't got the relevant control measures in place. You've identified what the risks are, but you're not actually actively doing something about this to make this an integral part of your business. And that then brings me on to the consequences of not taking this preventative and proactive approach. We in the UK have talked a lot about prevention and proactiveness as the right approach to health and safety. Rewind, a few years ago, 20 years ago or so on, where lots of businesses used to wait for something to happen, maybe not actively, but they would only take action when someone was hurt, or someone was injured, or someone was suffering an illness. The only way forward, I think, now in 2024 is to be preemptive in your approach, because one of the most serious consequences, if you get this wrong, is to be prosecuted. Right? The regulators are not shy in coming forward when it comes to highlighting non-compliance. So we talked about the legislation. If you are non-compliant with the legislation, straightforward approach is going to be you will be investigated for that non-compliance, and albeit the regulators have a number of options available to them, very often in the most serious of consequences, they will prosecute for the breach of Health and Safety at Work Act or the management regulations. So it is worth it just on that score to be preventative in your approach, in order to mitigate the risk of investigation, and therefore prosecution. But that's probably kind of the worst case scenario. I would say there are other things to think about in terms of the overall consequences of not addressing psychosocial risk. And it might well be that you have a situation where employees don't engage, employees feel that they're not supported, and therefore they're either going to go one of two ways. They'll carry on this machine where they don't feel supported, they've got lots of work, they're getting stressed as a result of their work patterns, and they will burn out, or they will suffer some sort of psychosocial maybe episode is probably the best way of putting it, or they will leave. And that's not great for the business either. So there are there's lots of different reasons to be proactive and preventative, much like you should be being proactive and preventative for health and safety, as we used to say, health and safety proper, when it was those are the well-known risks. Psychosocial risk is much more nuanced, and it's newer, fresher. It is going to become one of these well-established risks, I think, as time goes on. But you do have to really take this by the front foot, really, because the consequences are not only from a legal point of view, but they are financial in the essence of the progress of your business. They are moral in the fact that you don't want to lose people. You don't want people to be suffering from illness and so on, and potentially contractual, because as a result of not having their psychosocial needs met, not only could you face criminal repercussions, but also you could be sued for negligence or for failure to address these very identifiable psychosocial risks. So there's a lot of consequences, I think, for not getting it right and not being early in your preventative approach.
Yeah, and Kizzy, just so that to clarify the concept of psychosocial hazards, psychosocial hazards according to the the global standard ISO 45003, which we will talk about in a moment as well, divides it in three categories. First, the aspects of how a job is designed, managed, and organized, social factors, and then the work environment, tools, and resources. So in the aspects of how the job is organized, designed, and managed, you mentioned it already, workload, work pace, role conflict, role ambiguity. In the case of the social factors at work, all the way from organizational change management, or how you communicate with people, how leadership communicates, with its people, rewards and recognition, whether you're doing that or not. Leadership incompetence as well, that's a psychosocial factor as well.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the typical, bullying, harassment, victimization, and the different kinds of discrimination, that exists. And then the work environment and tools and resources, for instance, if you have the right equipment to do your job, if you're working in the right environment as well. So those are like the three main categories, right? And let me give you a very silly example, which is very minor, and then I'm going to go to the other side of the spectrum. We were running a workplace stressors survey to identify hazards of a psychosocial nature in this particular client. And it came up, and listen to how silly but how relevant this is, that something that was creating stress in this particular department was the lack of a printer, right? And seriously, and then it actually became systematic. We ran the survey again the quarter later, and they still hadn't bought the printer, and the printer was creating a high level of stress within the workers in that department, right? And just because we picked it up in that identification phase, it was just so simple. Just buy a printer, and just get that sorted. But don't ask me why. People didn't actually come forward with this earlier. But we had to have a system in place in which people say, hey, you know what, I don't have the right resources to do my work.
Yeah.
Or remote workers that the router was not working properly. Right. Now
that means employee engagement, right?
Exactly.
Or empowerment, for them to feel free to be able to share this information with their leaders and so on. And it brings me back maybe to that point that you raised about leadership competence. It's them having the foresight to be able to see from the top down what's going on in their workplace.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really difficult.
And for instance, that you bring the leadership competence aspect, right? In another client that we were working with, it came up a couple of quarters, in in 2 quarters actually continuously, that employees felt that leaders were not actually making the right decisions for the business.
Hmm.
Imagine that. So employees had a space to share that they actually felt stressed out and they felt anxious about the fact that leadership was not actually making the right choices for the business. And that forced the leadership to kind of think things through, and then to kind of analyze and reflect on their approach, right? And of course, the more sensitive elements, once you set up the system that allows you to identify hazards of this nature, then cases of discrimination will come up, and cases of victimization and harassment and bullying, because sometimes the way we ask these questions in the identification stage is we ask employees, have you experienced bullying or harassment in your, and we actually separate the questions bullying, harassment, victimization, and discrimination into 4 separate questions because they're 4 different things. So
Hmm.
have you experienced, for instance, discrimination, or have you, and the follow-up question is, have you witnessed discrimination? So people then get a chance to say, hey, this is what I'm seeing happening in my department. This is what I'm seeing happening in my business, and this needs to be addressed. And what I love about the identification element of the mental health and safety management system is that it forces management to say, hey, we've been measuring this for the past 2 quarters, and it keeps showing up that people feel discriminated against, or people feel bullied in these departments. We need to do something about this, right? And these cases will not show up in your traditional occupational health and management system. You have to insert that psychosocial module. So
But what I also get, I mean, a lot from clients, what, the why. It's the why do we need to do this? Why do we need to have another type of risk assessment? Why do we need to specifically address mental health and stress and well-being? And sometimes I feel like an approach to explaining the impact on other things is helpful. So, for example, leadership competence is something that you just raised again. We have talked about leadership, active leadership. We have talked about leading from the top. We have talked about, in terms of leading health and safety, for a long time. You have got the INDG 417 document, which produced by the HSE and the Institute of Directors, talks about this checklist that you should go through to incorporate in your policies to demonstrate how senior leaders are leading health and safety from the top. And it includes a lot of things, but one of these risks could actually include psychosocial risk, and how you are managing that from top level down. It should be a two-way process, but it is about how you're managing those risks, how you're monitoring those risks, and how you are implementing or at least instigating some sort of change for that. So if you were to demonstrate that approach, which is not only in line with in international standards, but also with that INDG document, it is a convincing factor to regulators that you are taking health and safety across the board seriously, and that will contribute, I think, to the need to have a specific risk assessment. On top of that, think about newer risks. So ESG, for example, the environment, social, and governance risk that a lot of businesses are now having to deal with. I've always said that health and safety feeds into ESG. Probably 80% of what is necessary to demonstrate ESG compliance. But psychosocial risk is a specific part of the social side. So actually, if they want to try and meet the social part of their ESG requirements, which are increasing all the time, and we're starting to see much more in terms of the global sustainable framework that is being applied when it comes to ESG, they will find that addressing psychosocial risk in this particular way is going to be extremely helpful when it comes to meeting those requirements for ESG.
And talking about ESG and CSR, last week I was spending time with a corporate finance executive, and she was telling me that she's got clients that she helps, get finance for, And that when they were applying for funding, and she mentioned several banks, most of the banks were saying, okay, we are going to consider your application so far as you can show me, what are your ESG goals and what are your CSR goals and what are you doing in this space, right?
Absolutely.
And everything that we're talking about right now, particularly the mental health and safety management systems, is the S in
Yeah.
CSR and
Yeah.
the S in ESG. So if you can show to them that you're actually actively, though you have a system in place that allows you to identify hazards of a psychosocial nature and obviously put control measures in place and everything else, that will fulfill that particular requirement. But it's interesting how, and she was telling me that these banks were not even, I mean, even if the financial robustness of the client was there, they would not even consider, introducing them to lenders unless they had, verifiable evidence, and not just a policy, because a lot of companies say, oh yeah, we've got an anti-bullying policy and we've got an
Yeah.
anti-discrimination policy. We're good, we're done. We're like, we tick that box, right? And that's
Doesn't
where
matter. Do
exactly.
what you say you do. I mean, action really does speak louder than words when it comes to policies. Because again, from a legal, from a regulatory point of view, regulators are not particularly interested in whether or not you have these great policies that are all singing, all dancing. They want to see a demonstration of the implementation of that policy and adherence of that policy. What evidence can you show that people are engaging with what you want them to as part of your policy approach? I mean, clients are, honestly, for us, clients are making such a big thing now of CSR and ESG to a certain extent, because they want to interrogate what is it that's going on behind the scenes. You may well be very good lawyers, you may well be very good health and safety practitioners, but actually we want the people that we work with to reflect our goals, our morals, our objectives. So do you have the right amount of diversity within your organization? Do you have those, as you say, anti-bullying policies? How can you demonstrate that your employees are engaged with that? What's the level of happiness at work? How do you monitor that? So they are asking the right questions now, whereas I'd say 10, 15 years ago, those questions weren't even a factor.
Yeah. And speaking of verifiable evidence, Kizzy, what's your view on ISO 45003 and the importance of implementing, a standard of that nature in one's business? What's your view on that?
Well, it's mixed. I'd say it's mixed. I mean, from an ISO standard, well, sorry, let me rewind. When clients come to me and they ask about compliance, they are generally talking about legal compliance with legislation or statute. So they know where they are with that. They know what they need to do on the whole. They know what the courts look for. When it comes to things like guidance, approved codes of practice, guidelines, it's a bit more woolly. So the likes of ISO 45001, 45003, for example, set of guidelines to manage psychosocial risk, which very comprehensive. And there is a lot of evidence to demonstrate that adhering to these guidelines can really improve that negative impact of psychosocial risk on employees. So the kind of argument for incorporating this into workplace systems and practices is absolutely made out, but it's a set of guidelines as opposed to ISO 45001, which is a standard, and so on. So one of the questions I get asked often is, do we have to? Do we have to follow ISO 45003? They're guidelines. And that's true, they are. But one of the things that we often say is if you've got a really, really good set of principles or set of guidelines that demonstrate a positive and active mitigation of risk, and in this case, it's psychosocial, psychological risks and hazards, why would you not follow it? Because actually, it's very easy to convince if this ever did progress into a court case of any nature, civil or criminal, it would be quite easy to demonstrate to a court that actually you have taken reasonable steps to mitigate or at least reduce the element of these risks occurring. So whilst in theory, this is not legislation, this is not something that you are being forced to comply with or to incorporate, it's a very, very good set of guidelines and principles that actually will be adopted by the court on the whole as if you are compliant with legislation. So I think there's a very strong argument to start looking at ISO 45003 as a very convincing set of guidelines for court, if it was ever to go that far.
As a matter of fact, in one of our earlier episodes, I had Andrew Brown, who's partner at Anderson Strathern in Scotland, top law firm there, and he was telling me that if he were to be representing a client, right, that is being sued for a breach in its duty of care, and particularly in relation to a situation concerning a psychosocial hazard or psychological injury or psychological harm, he said to me that if they were to show that they've implemented ISO 45003 from a legal standpoint, in some cases they will be off the hook, or in some cases the judge will be more lenient in case there's actually they have to pay for some level of award. So, and that's refreshing to know, because at least as you were saying, ISO 45003 is a set of guidelines. It's a child standard to 45001, but it will definitely force you to look, at psychosocial hazards at the level that one should be looking at it. Because when I look at companies' risk registers, and if I have to establish a ratio between, the traditional hazards and psychosocial hazards are like, 2% or 3% of the hazards that have been identified through their traditional occupational health and safety management systems. When now we know that hazards of a psychological nature have now surpassed hazards of a physical nature when it comes to creating ill health at work. I think now it's like 55% cases of ill health at work are of a psychological nature now. So now,
but do we attribute that to an increase in mental health or psychosocial risk, or is it just people are being more vocal about it?
What do you think?
I think the latter. I think we've always had mental health and well-being priorities. I do. I think they've always been there. Okay, maybe our environments or circumstances slightly different in 2024 as they were in 1974. But I think we are certainly much more vocal and maybe freer to be able to speak about these things and identify these or share these issues with our employers, which has now resulted in higher statistics. I also think that it's quite important to recognize not only that risk of civil cases, but the risk and the increase for criminal prosecutions, which is obviously my sweet spot and the area of law that I practice in. But we have had cases in the past where the likes of mental health, employee mental health, or psychosocial risk has been a factor that has aggravated the criminal penalties that are imposed. So while we don't have any direct prosecutions based on a failure to address psychosocial risk on its own. You would get that in the civil courts. What we do have, though, is this idea that any sort of stress-induced illness, particularly if it's reasonably foreseeable, could act as an aggravating factor, which then heightens the penalty. So, I mean, I think back to cases, well, there was one a few years ago, Sutherland and Hatton, where there was an appeal heard by a number of employees. Well, sorry, the employers appealed, but it was all in relation to employees who were awarded compensation, who were proved to have suffered stress-induced psychiatric illness. And it was all about whether employers should have to pay compensation for stress induced illness if it wasn't reasonably foreseeable. If it was reasonably foreseeable, then yes, fine. But employers should have this standpoint that they can assume employees can withstand a particular level of the pressures of the job. But the outcome is probably not important, but it was really the principles that were discussed in that case. And I just think if they were adopted today, the levels of fines that we would be talking about for outcomes that have been exacerbated as a result of employee mental health not being addressed properly would be very, very high indeed. It talked about employers not having to make inquiries about employees' mental health, which again, I think now, fast forward to now, that's not true. Employers do have a duty to make some inquiries or some searching inquiries about employees' mental health. They've got to look at the indications that impending harm to mental health at work could dictate they should be taking some action. This is all about our risk assessments. Again, it's the idea that employers should proactively look to offer counselling with access to treatment if necessary, if they are found to be in breach of their duty of care. So it was a good way of introducing and maybe normalizing the discussion around mental health and well-being. But the one case that really made, I would say, us in the health and safety community sit up and take notice when we were looking at a particular type of workplace risk was fatigue as a result of the workplace conditions and having to work longer hours. It was generally, I think, around the time of coronavirus, but the case of Renown, which I think at the time was actually the first prosecution of its kind by a UK regulator. The organisation Renown were prosecuted for a specific failure to assess and manage workplace fatigue. So it wasn't really about the workplace standards or workplace arrangements like it would usually be in respect of a usual health and safety prosecution. It was about the fact that they failed to assess workplace fatigue and they didn't enforce their own fatigue policies. Back to our idea of it's great to have these policies in place, but if you're not doing anything about them or at least not monitoring they're being implemented and adhered to, then it's not worth the paper it's written on. And that case came all around a fatal car accident on a public highway where an employee driver fell asleep whilst driving. And it's because he was exceeding the working time limit for really safety critical work and the limits that were actually specified in Renown's own policies. And it's all because the employer wasn't proactive enough or at least diligent enough to monitor the management of welfare issues like fatigue, general well-being, mental health. So it means that the door is open for these risks to be enhanced as a result of a failure to adhere to their own policies, let alone looking at psychosocial risk. So regulators are going to start making, I think, better use of the options available open to them when it comes to employers not taking a firm stance when it comes to general well-being and mental health monitoring.
Now, I have a question about this particular case that you were mentioning. So what if the employer would have said, to the court, hey, but by the way, this employee, there's an open door policy. He could have actually expressed that, he felt fatigue or that he felt that he was working too many hours. So it's part of the employer's responsibility to express that, right? And I think from my point of view, that's a weak argument because the company should actually have a system in place that systematically tries to identify that. In addition, of course, to the employee being able to speak to the manager or to speak to the supervisor or to speak, to whomever they need to speak in order to address the situation. But what can strengthen the employer's position in this particular case is to actually have a system in place that allows them to identify those kinds of situations, right? And so given that prosecution is your sweet spot, Kizzy, what are the sentencing guidelines like in today's environment?
This is the bit where I get thrown in and to scare people, right? So it's I mean, the sentencing guidelines have been around now for some time, since 2016, is it? So I mean, we're at a stage where we have an idea of what these look like, and the reason we have these guidelines, for those who perhaps aren't familiar with them, is because it was suggested that in health and safety, the penalties that were being imposed sort of prior to 2016 were either not consistent or were not enough of a deterrent to encourage organizations and individuals to adopt this preventative, proactive approach to health and safety. And actually, it wasn't in line with other regulatory frameworks, such as kind of the fraud framework, or even the environmental framework, which we had probably the year before these guidelines were in place. So the sentencing guidelines were put in place, and it set up a couple of parameters that the judges, if this was a case that was unfortunate enough to go all the way to court, the judges now have a framework or a matrix that they can look at when deciding on how to sentence an organization or an individual for breaches of health and safety. And I did say to you, I was pulling it up now. It's split into, I would say, the first three categories, which are the bits that organizations can have an impact over. The first one is the level of culpability of an organization, which is all the way from very high to low. And it just sets out what an organization's culpability could be like. So again, let me kind of read it out so I'm not misquoting the guidelines themselves. So very high is something like a very deliberate breach or a flagrant disregard of the law. Where I think a lot of organizations could fall into, particularly from a psychosocial risk perspective, is where an organization has fallen far short of the appropriate standard expected of them as I don't know, a large, global, diligent organization, where they fail to put in place measures that are recognized standards in the industry, right? We have some recognized standards here already. Where there's a failure to make appropriate changes to previous incidents where health and safety risk exposure has been a factor, or allowing breaches to subsist for a long period of time. So you may have a culture, for example, that promotes and fosters or doesn't seek to prevent mental health risks or workplace stresses, and that is likely to subsist for a long period of time. Again, this will be used as an aggravating feature. So you'll be placed into a culpability bracket, but then you'll also be placed into a harm category. The harm category talks about the seriousness of harm risked. So this is where, for the first time, when these guidelines came in, we were no longer talking about physical injury. We weren't talking about what actually physically happened to someone, albeit that is also an aggravating factor when you come on to look at the guidelines later on. It's looking at what is the seriousness of harm risked? What is the worst case scenario, in theory, that could happen if you get this wrong, if you don't address these type of risks, including psychosocial hazards and risks. So you'll be placed in a harm category, and then you have to counter that by the likelihood of that particular risk occurring. So that's the second part. The third part is the money part, where the judge is encouraged to look at the level of turnover of the organization. Even just taking those three areas on the premise that an organization is in the high culpability bracket, so that one that I was just going through the different options with you, and a harm category 1 or 2, which is fairly serious. A large organization, this is just an example, a large organization with a turnover of 50 million or more being placed in that bracket could face a fine, if it's harm category 1, of £2.4 million. That is without any physical injury occurring. And that's why I think the importance of psychosocial risk is going to start to become, it already is starting to become quite prevalent when it comes to commenting on the circumstances of a breach. But this is where I think it's going to come into its own more and more and more, is because the courts will only talk about risk. They start with risk. So this is just another risk that can be incorporated into that discussion when particularly from a prosecutor. If a prosecutor wanted to throw everything in, they'll start talking about the fact that not only have you failed to appreciate the level of risk involved from a health and safety physical point of view, but also the mental health side. You haven't appreciated the psychological or psychosocial risks involved, which has somehow contributed to the overall impact of this accident or incident, if there was one. So these are the sorts of things that judges are now talking about and they are looking at. Even if you are a smaller organization, so for example, you're a medium organization, same brackets, culpability and seriousness of harm risk, but your turnover is between 10 and 50 million, a circumstance like that could result in a £950,000 fine for that prosecution. Now, there is they do have a category range, so you can go down or go up based on your mitigation or aggravating factors. But the fact that these are the starting point fines for situations where you may not have a physical injury at all, that is scary stuff. So that's why I did say people, when they talk about the sentencing guidelines, you're normally brought in to scare the living daylights out of people. It isn't really about that. It is about being aware that this is the direction of travel. And the way to mitigate these very, very dire consequences is to start from the beginning, is to be preventative, is to be proactive, is to put the business in the best possible position they possibly can be to avoid these situations in the first place.
Goodness me, those fines are just a starting point.
Yes. I mean, it is what it is. But again, as I said, the reason for them, if we have an awareness of why we have these situations, why do we have these guidelines, for example? We have it because the fines before these were in the tens of thousands. So, one of my opening gambits to a client would be, oh, well, okay, if you've got one breach, then the maximum penalty for this is £20,000 if we keep this in the lower courts. So we might want to think about a guilty plea on that basis, and we'll then be satisfied that our fine is never going to be more than 10,000 or 15,000. We are not in that category anymore. We're in a situations where £1 million fines for health and safety breaches are commonplace for large organizations with that turnover of 50 million or more. So we are no longer in the situation where we can rest on capped fines, or we can rest on, well, the mitigation is no one was injured. That isn't mitigation in the same way that it used to be, because it doesn't matter if anyone was injured. What matters is what risks have we exposed people to. That's the key.
Now, Kizzy, imagine that someone listening to this says, "Okay, I need to get my act together. I've been managing a traditional occupational health and safety quite well in the past, but now we've got this whole realm of psychosocial risks." If people were to come to you and say, "Kizzy, help me out here. What are the first steps that I need to take in order to make sure that I'm not only complying with legislation, but I'm doing the best I can in order to mitigate the impact of psychosocial risk in my business?"
Okay. Well, I can give some tips. Obviously, we could be here all day if we were to carry on. But I'd say top tips from my experience in the law, but also my experience from industry and from practice, what I think would work very well. If you haven't already done it, start thinking about conducting a specific stress risk assessment, because I think that's the only way really that you will understand what those stress factors are as a potential hazard. And then as an employer and as a diligent employer, you can identify areas of work that might be causing or contributing to those stress levels. Your employees will thank you for it. It will help employers perhaps develop targeted and controlled interventions to reduce those levels in the workplace, which then means you can follow on changes to work processes, distribution of work, communication and engagement protocols, as well as, I suppose, providing ongoing support and resources to employees who are already suffering from stress-related issues. And once you've got those systems in place, once you've identified those risks, approach this like you would a normal health and safety, fire safety risk assessment. Review those measures that you have in place, at least on an annual basis, to ensure that they're effective. Because again, it's no point having these systems in place and not testing or stress testing them or interrogating them to ensure that they are still effective a year on, or when there's been a significant change in the business. So I think that's first port of call. Second port of call is maybe to look at work-life balance, if such a thing does exist. But I think from an employer's point of view, it's got to be encouraging flexible working where possible, and where it's not going to impact on the overall production of work, but also not going to impact the team itself. So, for example, we now, at our workplace, we have a non-policy policy, which is we're not expecting employees to come cap in hand with a flexible working application or a request. Not necessary really to go through formal channels. However, it is necessary to assess whether or not flexible working, such as working from home or working remotely, is going to have an impact on the rest of the team. So yes, you can do it where it doesn't impact on the team in a negative way. But it's not just about flexible working, it's about realistic workloads. It's about encouraging employees to engage with their senior leaders and their line managers. Promotion of that kind of healthy work-life integration, I think, will help to prevent stress in the first place, and certainly prevent burnout. And it also shows employees that as an employer, you value them. You want them to be in a less pressured environment. You want them to feel like they can come and speak to their employers if there is a problem, or even if there isn't a problem, that they can feel free to be vulnerable and open and normalize the conversation about mental health. And that just brings me on to perhaps the third point, is this open communication. Even from a legal standpoint, there is, I would say, this open communication will go a long way to demonstrate that you have the right systems in place. You have a culture that prioritizes mental health and open communication, where employees can discuss their concerns and can seek support actively. But that is going to only be led by the senior leadership team. It means that we have to make sure, back to our leadership competence, managers, directors have the right skills. They have the competence to deal with those sensitive conversations with employees. They know how to identify work-related stress. They can prevent the symptoms by offering the support, as we said beforehand. That might mean upskilling on effective stress management techniques for themselves before they can even support employees who are experiencing stress-related issues. What does that support look like? Or maybe that's number 4. So offering the support both from an internal perspective, but also external resource if necessary. I think employers need to understand they don't necessarily have all the resources and skills to manage good mental health. So that might mean going outside, having a wellbeing program that's implemented by an external provider that provides, I don't know, lifestyle assessments, mental health days, gym memberships. It used to be mental health was about providing fruit on a daily basis. It really is obviously more than that, but it's about what those initiatives look like to demonstrate to employees that they are valued, their health is valued, their happiness is valued, and all of that is going to reduce stress levels and increase engagement, I think. So those are kind of just some things that they can also think about incorporating if they haven't already. But the last thing I would say is just to build awareness of what these risks are and what the impact of those risks can have on your workplace and your systems. That means understanding what a duty of care is. That means understanding that there are things that you ought to do, that you need to do to ensure that you are providing that duty of care to employees, because the potential consequences, as we have now discussed, are quite dire. And that means not only from being sued for stress-related issues, but also the potential for this to spill over into the criminal sphere as well, and being prosecuted for not managing risk properly.
Yeah. And Kizzy, one last question. So if, let's say, a business already has the traditional occupational health and safety management system as certified by ISO 45001, should they go for 45003 just to make sure that they get it right?
I would say yes. I think there are a lot of real benefits actually for using the ISO 45003 framework. We have talked about the legalities around this, so the things that you need to do to comply with the management of the management regs, for example. Understanding what your organizational structure looks like and building organizational resilience is key. Right, so that means you have to have a good risk management system. You need a good network. You need to show that you're adaptive to potentially stressful situations and changes while maintaining that good mental health approach for employees. The 45003 will give you that. They'll give you the tools to do that. Improved awareness, as I said, using those guidelines will only help with the monitoring and training of employers and employees, actually, because I think employees will get a better understanding of their own well-being, while the senior leaders will be able to learn how to identify any risks associated with mental ill health. And then all of the things that follow with incorporating guidelines such as this, you'll have better productivity of employees who are going to be at work more if they feel free and able and valued and able to talk about some of these things if they need to. You will have better recruitment and retention statistics, because this is a much more attractive place to work for new people, but also you'll keep the people that you've already got. If you're having these very inclusive systems in place, you're going to be well on the way to achieving legal compliance with these guidelines in place. You'll reduce absenteeism, with people needing to have time off to recover from mental ill health. And you'll just have better communication with the workforce, because the guidelines will give that framework for increased and better communication between employees and employers, remove whatever barriers there might well be, and encourage everybody to work together, because at the end of the day, both employees and employers have legal obligations to meet under health and safety. The guidelines are just going to help facilitate the communication necessary to ensure that everybody is doing what they need to do and what they can do reasonably to meet those obligations.
Fantastic. So the resounding answer is yes. And I'm not
Although
surprised because
I don't necessarily, I'm not, I can't be an advocate for any provider or even for the standards, but I do think if I was talking from a strict legal point of view, it would make sense to think about guidelines on the whole as a really good route to being legally compliant with your obligations.
yeah, and that's where the world is going. Actually, I've been looking at the certification rates for the top 5 or the top 7 actually ISO standards,
Yeah,
including obviously quality management 9001 and the cybersecurity 27001 and the
yeah.
environmental one, etc. And 45001 coupled with 45003 right now is the fastest growing ISO standard in the world. And if the trend continues, it might actually overtake the most popular ISO standard, which is 9001, the quality management one,
Mm.
in about 10 years' time. So I'm just happy that the world is going in that direction. And I'm hoping as well that businesses, will get on this bandwagon as well. Standards actually, I know you cannot advocate for specific standards, but I think that you've been very
Well,
clear. You've been very clear in articulating the value and the benefits of going the
absolutely.
standards route. Yeah.
And what I can say is this, and again, looking forward with a kind of horizon watching eyes, certainly the direction of travel is about certification. I mean, recent legislation that we've had in the UK has all been about accountability. And one of the ways to demonstrate accountability and competence has been looking at certification. So when you look at 45003 on its own, Okay, it's a set of guidelines. When you put, as you said, when you put that together with 45,001, it's offering that certification actually that demonstrates compliance with the principles and helps to maintain a really robust occupational health and safety management system. And I think you can only do that by incorporating 45,003 into the ISO standards that you have.
Fantastic, Kizzy. Kizzy, this has been a very enlightening conversation. I've learned so much, from you today,
So it's always good to
and
talk to you.
you're just a wealth of knowledge and experience and wisdom and inspiration as well. And hopefully, business leaders will not feel inspired just by the sentencing guidelines, but
No,
inspired
no.
inspired by the whole retention, talent attraction, performance, everything that you've mentioned that are elements that attract, employees, to specific business that actually offer that kind of environment, right? So thank you so much for your time. And now it's my turn to put you on the spot, my dear Kizzy. So, and this is a question that we ask, all of our guests, which is, can you name one or two heroes that you have in your life, past or present?
Oh,
People that have inspired you, people that have influenced you, people that have changed your perspective in in life, in your profession. Just one or two individuals that have really had a massive impact in
that's
the
a really
person that.
interesting question. Oh
Yeah.
my God. Okay, so I could talk about it actually from a couple of standpoints. Um, in my field, in health and safety, sorry, in the legal profession, I certainly have seen quite a lot, and I was influenced and inspired by Dame Linda Dobbs, who was actually the first Black High Court judge, and she's just an amazing person. All that she'd done from a diversity perspective, because it helped to be able to see what you could be, but also the fact that she was fantastic at her craft, and it really wasn't about color for her, but it was about extending that ladder to show that she could do these things. She could be in the echelons of the legal profession, but still find time to help others. So she travels a lot. She teaches other judges on how to approach their judicial careers, both here and abroad. And also, I just welcome the fact that she actually let me come and do work experience with her when I was a lot younger than now, with her, just to see what it was like in her chambers, and it helped me really understand that I wanted to be a lawyer. So with all of the accolades that she had in life, I think one of the biggest things I could say about her was she inspired me to be a lawyer and to be the type of lawyer that she is, always helping people despite having a massively busy practice. The other person I would certainly say who has helped me change the way I look at things from a health and safety perspective was the partner that I worked with at one of my very first firms when I started out in health and safety almost 20 years ago, Dr. Simon Joyston Beckles. So he I mean, I hadn't been doing health and safety before then. I was a criminal lawyer, and that was all I wanted to be. But he opened my eyes to the world of health and safety and how fantastic it was. I know that not everyone will share my enthusiasm for health and safety, but it is a real, it's an area of law that I think affects absolutely everybody. And learning from him, learning how to be absolutely excellent at your craft and what you do and what you know, but also having the idea that this world is about awareness and it's about building awareness. And actually, health and safety, this world of health and safety, is just as much about client relationships and people than the law. And for me, I've always led with people. Maybe that is a health and safety thing. But he showed me how important it was to maintain relationships with people, whether that is doing training, whether that is advising them on their obligations, or whether that is defending them in court. It doesn't matter. We start with the relationship. And that's how we get to know people. That's how they learn to trust us. That's how they come back to us when they need us. People tend to instruct people who they like, who they get on with. So he taught me that. He definitely taught me how to kind of lead with people first. And I do that to this day.
All right, that sounds so cool, Kizzy. And finally, please complete the following sentence. The world would be a better place if...
Oh gosh. People thought about people more.
Beautifully said, Kizzy. Beautifully said. On that note, Kizzy, thank you so much for taking the time, to join our podcast. Again, it's been enlightening. It's been fun. It's been scary at times, but
I hope not too scary. Don't
no, no,
worry,
no, no.
we have the answers, César. That's the thing.
Yeah.
We need to tell the people that are listening, even if it was a little scary, you and I, and the likes of you and I, have the answers for them.
Yeah, exactly. Kizzy, again, thank you so much for being who you are. And hopefully I'll see you in a future episode, right?
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you, Kizzy. Bye.
Bye.